Join me in my continued search to find the greatest film ever made. Today I take a look at 1984. Welcome to my ranking of films which came out in the year 1984, or at least the ones that I've seen. This time last week I had only seen 16 films that came out in 84. I have since watched an additional 4 movies over the past 7 days to take our total today to 20. So we've got the same amount that we had for the 82 and 83 list. So though in my opinion, the quality of films in 84 is stronger than in those 2 years. And in fact, this might be the strongest ranking we've had in this series so far in terms of the consistency of the quality of the films all the way through the ranking. The film which has come bottom today, in my opinion, is a pretty decent film. It's just been really unlucky to be on this list with all these quality movies. Now, a very quick reminder before we get into it that the top film today will go through to the eventual grand final of 100 films. And the film which comes second may also join it in that final, numbers permitting. So let's get into it then and find out what that unlucky film is I was just talking about. This is very much a film from my childhood. I watched it several times growing up. It seemed to be on TV every year. I'm afraid to watch it now as an adult because I just think it would ruin my rose-tinted memory of it. That happened to me with another film recently. I saw a film called Cyborg with Jean-Claude Van Damme in it when I was a young teen, and at the time I seem to remember thinking it was one of the greatest action films I'd ever seen. Tried watching it in my 30s and it was like a completely different movie. I was just like, whoa, this isn't the same movie, surely. If I watch Neverending Story now, I'm pretty sure that a similar thing would happen to me, so I'd never want to watch it again, even though it is a pretty good film. There are a couple of bits in it that I really remember. So there's a part where the adventurer has to go through this gateway thing and there's like a statue firing down bolts at him. That creeped me out a little bit as a kid. And also the famous scene where he's on this white sock puppet creature thing and they chase the bullies and they jump into the trash can. That was always fun to watch. This is a Charles Bronson fronted thriller about an assassin who has to go on a mission to take down this really evil guy. It's very much of the Death Wish mould in that Bronson's going around killing people here and there and being really suave while he's doing it. I've seen this one a couple of times actually. It's decent, although it does leave a little bit of a bitter aftertaste because the villain in this is absolutely vile. He routinely tortures people to death in all sorts of nasty ways. He puts glass down people's throats, he electrocutes them, and he's just not a very pleasant individual at all. But if you like old school thrillers, then you might enjoy this one. It's not bad at all. Here's another one from my childhood. I would regularly bounce from things like The Neverending Story to The Exterminator 2 when I was growing up. That was just my life. If anything, this is more of a Death Wish type movie than the one that I was just talking about, actually. I can't remember who actually plays the Exterminator, but I definitely rented this via my dad a couple of times in the sort of late 80s, early 90s. I distinctly remember the big showdown at the end where the Exterminator tricks the bad guy into opening the bag. And the rest of the film's very entertaining as well. I've never seen the first one. I heard at some point that he doesn't use the flamethrower in the original film, which I find kind of weird. I would like to go back and watch this second one as well. I'd like to watch both of them these days. It's just I don't want to spend money on them. I don't really want to buy DVDs and Blu-rays for these particularly, but certainly if they ever come up on Prime going for free at some point, I would absolutely dive back in there and have some nostalgia. A couple of things about this one. Firstly, you could argue that it's more of a 1985 movie, but it did get a release in Italy in late 1984, which is why I've allowed it to be included here. Second thing of note is that this is the only film I've bought for my shelf over the course of the past month. I bought a very good Arrow release that cost me £18. I sort of regret it a little bit now because it's not a very good movie. I'd not seen it before I bought it. I bought it on the strength of the first one, which I absolutely loved. It came fourth, I think, in my 1978 or 1979 rankings. But this sequel is very uninspired. They've basically just thrown another bunch of people in the desert and they get picked off one by one, the end. And there's even a villain who I'm sure died in the first movie but is miraculously alive for this one. So it's not great. Although I am at least looking forward to watching the commentary track on there by the Hysteria Continues, because they always do great commentaries. But there we go. I'm sure I'm not the only horror fan out there who spends ridiculous amounts of money on films sometimes that he doesn't even like. It's a disease that I guess some of us cannot cure and maybe wouldn't want to. This is an 80s classic which has had a bit of an upsurge recently with the release of the Netflix series Cobra Kai. I watched the first season of that and I did really enjoy it, but I didn't then carry on because just because I enjoyed one season, it didn't mean I wanted to watch a gazillion seasons. I do that a lot with TV shows. Even if I really enjoy them, it doesn't mean that I want to go and watch 200 episodes of the same thing being repeated and repeated. So it is recommended if you like The Karate Kid. I was sort of lukewarm on it growing up. I tended to watch them just because they were always on TV, 1, 2, and 3. I never did watch the one with the girl or the Will Smith remake, but certainly the original trilogy, I saw a lot of it when I was growing up. The first film is probably the best, but the bit that I remember the most is not at the end with the cheesy crane kick. It's more the scene where Daniel gets chased through the school by all the bullies dressed as skeletons. I found that quite creepy when I was watching it as a child. It's got a little bit of a horror element to it, that section. So yeah, it's always stuck in my mind. As I said in my Arnold Schwarzenegger rankings, I've only seen Conan the Destroyer once, whereas I've seen Conan the Barbarian multiple times. Out of the two of them, that was the one that always seemed to be on TV the most when I was growing up, which is a little bit strange in my eyes because I'm pretty sure that the first film is the most violent of the two, and British TV were very strict in terms of what violence they would put on their screens in the 80s and 90s. They would regularly edit films themselves before they allowed them to be shown. So you'd think if they were going to show either of the two Conan films repeatedly, it would have been Conan the Destroyer, but I definitely need to rewatch the sequel. I can remember enjoying it that one time that I did see it, but this and The Exterminator 2, out of the films on today's ranking, are the ones which it was borderline as to whether I could include them because my memory of both is getting a little bit hazy now, but certainly I've never been bored watching Arnold Schwarzenegger playing Conan. This was a first time watch for me. Children of the Corn was originally a short story which Stephen King included in his Night Shift collection. It's strange to me to think that that one short story led to a movie, which has then led to a big 11 movie franchise. There are some Stephen King novels, full length novels, which have still not been adapted into movies. One of my favourite Stephen King books of all time, Desperation, to my knowledge, has still never had a movie. But going back to Children of the Corn, I quite enjoyed it. I think there's a bit too much of the main characters running around in the daylight trying to avoid the kids rather than crawling around in the corn stalks in the dark. I think if you've got a location where you've got field after field of corn going in all directions, you should use that more. I think the short story uses that terror a lot better. Linda Hamilton's in this. She looks a little bit unsure of herself. Maybe it wasn't the right script for her. This was around about the time she did Terminator, so you would think that she would have been a bit more confident of herself in a leading role. And the special effects at the end of this film are absolutely terrible. But for all that, I still enjoyed it. And at some point, I would still like to do a full review series of this. And here's something I've already done a full review series for. I have got an entire playlist devoted to A Nightmare on Elm Street. I have reviewed all the films. I've even got a franchise ranking in there as well. Having said that, this is not really my series. I can appreciate some of the earlier ones, 1, 3, and 4 are particularly excellent, but there's just too many poor films in this series, in my opinion, for me to call myself a fully fledged Freddy fan. Even this original film has not even made it into my top 10 films from 1984. It's always amused me that one of my favourite things from the original, though, is one of the things that a lot of the genuine fans really hate, which is the ending. I love that ending. I think it shakes things up and makes you question what was real and what wasn't from the sort of half an hour or so leading up to the finale. But look, this is a classic film and a really original film, an important film for horror. I did give it 4 out of 5 when I reviewed it. It's just not a film and a franchise which I will go back to in the future as much as I go back to, say, Friday the 13th or Halloween. And in terms of any Nightmare on Elm Street films possibly getting through to my grand final of 100 films, I would say no chance. Dream Master and Dream Warriors may crack the top 10 possibly of their respective years when we get there, but that's about as good as it's going to get for this franchise. I thought Ghostbusters would do a lot better than 12th, but in all honesty, I'm just a little bit tired of watching these. I could do with going a whole decade without seeing any of them, particularly 1 and 2, just to get some of my enthusiasm back for this world and these characters, which are great, don't get me wrong. But I watched these every year growing up, and more recently as a parent, my oldest son got into Ghostbusters, so I had to watch the films repeatedly with him as well. I've always preferred the second one as well, which feels a little bit unfair because the first film is a really original film, whereas the second one just uses the template of the first film but changes things around a little bit. But there's always been more stuff in the second film which has appealed to me. You know, the underground train tunnels, the pink goo, the Titanic ghost ship thing, Vigo the Carpathian. The only thing the first film has, which I really love, is the Marshmallow Man segment. I loved the Marshmallow Man even outside of the movie when I was a kid. This was another one of my first time watches. I'd never even heard of it until last week. And how I came across it, basically, I typed in 1984 movies into Amazon Prime because I still had a couple of slots left to try and get up to 20, and I wanted to see what was on my streaming services that I could watch for free potentially. And I wasn't that keen on watching this at first because it looked like a kind of rape revenge thing, and I'm not really into those. I got completely burned by the I Spit on Your Grave remake last year. I'm still trying to get the images of that film out of my head. So I almost skipped past Savage Street. I think what persuaded me to give it a go ultimately was the fact that Linda Blair's in it, and I really like her from Hell Night, not so much from The Exorcist. But to my surprise, this didn't feel like your bog standard, sleazy rape revenge film. Half the film feels like Carrie with its sort of cynical look at teenagers going into the latter stages of their school life, and it no longer feels appropriate for, in their eyes, for teachers to be pushing them around. And the villains in this are fascinating. They're not your typical punks who just take the opportunity to rape a girl and then look dumbfounded when they get taken out at the end of the movie. The leader in this in particular, he has a sort of evolving psychosis where he starts out just taking the piss out of people. Then there's the rape scene. Then later on, he's dropping girls off bridges. He's absolutely crazy, this guy, and some of his followers. I couldn't take my eyes off this film. It was gripping in a number of ways. The only thing I didn't like was the actual rape scene. I mean, they've got the actress lying there on the floor, completely naked, with 4 guys putting their hands all over it. I think they could have left some clothes on, given her some dignity. I mean, the rape scene takes place in what's basically a broom cupboard at school. So within the context of the story, it would have been reasonable for the attackers to think that somebody could have come across the scene at any moment. So surely they could have just kept the clothes on or half the clothes on and done what they needed to do. But that aside, this film did surprise me. It was actually pretty good. I've never really thought of Beverly Hills Cop as a franchise that I'm a fan of, and yet, whenever I've been watching one of these, I've never been able to take my eyes off them. There's a certain magnetism about the Axel Foley character which just keeps you watching. I saw 1 and 2 quite a few times growing up. I think 1 was better than 2 in all honesty, but even the third film is pretty watchable given the fact that one of the main actors had jumped ship by then. There's always been talk of a potential 4th film. If you go on the Beverly Hills Cop film series Wikipedia page, there's like a massive essay about the development hell that the 4th film has been stuck in for about 25 years. It seems like every couple of years they've almost got into filming of this and not quite been able to do it because of script problems and this, that, and the other. they're still on about possibly making it. Could Eddie Murphy still play this character 25 years on from the third film? I've got my doubts. I mean, surely he sounds and looks a lot different now as an old guy than he did back then, but who knows? It's kind of a similar situation with Lethal Weapon 5, that potential film. I mean, should Danny Glover and Mel Gibson come back now after all this time? I don't know. Harrison Ford in Indiana Jones 5, I could go on, but anyway, the original Beverly Hills Cop is my first film in the top 10 today. This is an often forgotten superhero film which came out during the Christopher Reeve Superman era. I enjoyed it 2 or 3 times when I was growing up. It's quite campy, and yet at other times it's a little bit dark as well, especially when the main villainess is on the screen. She creeped me out a little bit when I was a little boy watching this. And the scene late on where she sends Supergirl to the Phantom Zone, I was on the edge of my seat in that part because, I mean, Supergirl's crawling up this rubble and I think her mentor sort of gets blown away. And I just found that very dark to watch as a kid. Probably now I would have a completely different opinion. I've not watched this in the longest time. I did watch the Supergirl TV show for a while, a few years ago. I think out of all those superhero shows that have been on the CW in recent years, others being The Flash and Legends of Tomorrow, I think the Supergirl one is the best of those. But it's hard to imagine that many youngsters these days getting anything out of the 1984 Supergirl now that they've got things like Marvel and stuff. But certainly, I always enjoyed it when I was growing up. I've never bought into the theory that the odd numbered Star Trek films are bad. I've never seen a bad Star Trek film, and I'm not the biggest fan of this franchise. I've not even seen all of them. I've seen them up to about Star Trek First Contact, so there's still quite a few I've not seen. I saw this particular one for the first time last summer. I thought it was a good, solid continuation of the story and characters who roll over from part two. I couldn't reel you off a big list of reasons why I enjoyed this. I just remember it being a good, solid couple of hours. Christopher Lloyd's in there as a villain. I would have liked to have seen more of the space station that they visit in the first half of the film, but that's only a minor complaint. But if any of the Star Trek films were going to get to the grand final, it was going to be The Wrath of Khan, and that just missed out. I think it came third in my 1982 rankings. Me and my brother used to absolutely love this film when we were growing up, and just recently I revisited it on Blu-ray for the first time in a long while. When you really break it down and analyze it, it's a very basic concept. I mean, once Alex gets into space, all he really does is climb into his fighter jet thing, shoot a few UFOs, and voila, he's saved the frontier. But it's just the whole fantasy of this kid playing a video game, being good at it, and then suddenly he's the savior of the galaxy. I'm sure most gamers at some point have thought to themselves, oh, wouldn't it be awesome if my skill at what I do actually led to fame and fortune? I don't think this was that successful at the box office, hence why they only ever made one of them, but certainly on a personal level, I will never forget the day that Alex and Maggie went to the stars. So far, we've only got one Friday the 13th film in the grand final, which is the original. And I'm starting to think that might be it because the final chapter has only come sixth today. And officially, it's my favourite film in the franchise. And the competition's only going to get stronger as we go through the 80s and the 90s. I do think possibly the original benefited from a slightly weaker field in 1980. But if we do only end up with one Jason film in the grand final, so be it. There's not that much more I can say about part four, which I didn't already say in my full review, which I only did a month or two ago. Go check that out if you want to. But this film is one of the great slasher films from the 80s, one of the great slasher films of all time, in all honesty. It's got a great Jason played by Ted White. It's got my personal favourite female character of the whole franchise in Sarah or Sarah. I don't even know her name, even though she's my favourite. Typical bloke, aren't I? But in summary, this is a really, really great film of its type. This is a film I've always really enjoyed, and its sequel, Jewel in the Nile. Michael Douglas and Kathleen Turner had an amazing chemistry when they used to do movies together. And this story of them randomly hooking up in the middle of Colombia, and they've got to dodge all these mercenaries, and they find this green emerald which allows them to buy a big yacht which they then sail off down New York High Street in. It's just fabulously entertaining. And as dangerous as Colombia is, it looks fantastic in movies. I'm presuming they actually did film in Colombia. Probably somebody will type in the comments that this was filmed in Vancouver or something, but whether it was real Colombia or not, it looks great, just as it did in the Schwarzenegger film Collateral Damage. I love the Gremlins franchise. I used to live on the same street as this pizza parlor, which was called Gizmo's, and it actually had a picture of Gizmo on the awning with a slice of pizza in his mouth, and that just always made me feel like I had a little connection to the films, which most other people didn't. This first film, it is a Christmas movie. Don't let anybody tell you different. So is Die Hard. It's got so many fun elements to it. My mum gave me a ticking off once for laughing at the part where the old woman on the Stanner stair lift gets blown through the window. It's got such a great climax in the sports shop, and the scene where all the gremlins gather in the cinema and start singing Hi Ho, it's just absolutely brilliant. And I love the sequel as well. So here we have today's unlucky film, which almost makes it to the grand final, but not quite. Sergio Leone's 4-hour gangster epic starring Robert De Niro and James Woods butting heads. I used to absolutely love this film. I still do, but now that I've sort of occasionally watched it for a good 15 years or more, there are little things about it that piss me off. It was very close between this and the film in second, which we'll come to. But there's a few little complaints about this which just have held it back today and dropped it back into third. So, firstly, the rape scenes in this are really weird and out of place. You probably gathered by now that I don't particularly like rape in movies, but more than that, the entire last half an hour of this is really bizarre. It's sort of implied that it might be a dream, but even if it's not a dream, it's still not a particularly satisfying conclusion. This film, as long as it is, does leave you with a lot of unanswered questions about certain character fates and what might have been going on at such and such a part of the timeline or whatever. It's still a great film. I do want to finish on that note. I've probably just had too many years to kind of pick apart at the edges with this, if you see what I mean. But anyway, let's get on and find out which two films are going through to the grand final, starting with the film in second place. Yep, Indiana Jones is now 2 for 2 in terms of films going through to the grand final. We already have Raiders qualifying by winning the 1981 rankings, and by virtue of Temple of Doom coming second today, it will almost certainly be joining Raiders in that final. This was a magical film for me growing up, Temple of Doom. I saw it in the cinema when I was about 4 and I loved it. I was begging my mum for weeks afterwards for her to rent it for me, and my mum had to say it's not out on home video yet, so she had to constantly get me Raiders instead. I always used to love the segment with the minecart. Some people don't think this is as good as Raiders or The Last Crusade, but for somebody who is primarily a horror fan, I think I was always more likely to really stick up for this film because it is the darkest of the original trilogy. It is the one Indiana Jones film which does feel like it has one foot firmly in the horror genre. All that underground cult stuff and the nasty stuff that goes on down there in the caves. You could argue that Once Upon a Time in America is technically a better film than Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, but when I compare this to Noodles and his adventures, I don't know, this film just warms my heart a lot more than Sergio Leone's film. So this is going through to the final. It's now time to find out which film from 1984 I like even more than Temple of Doom. Boom, 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 boom. Yeah, I'm a massive Terminator fan. I have been my entire life. I've been there pretty much since the beginning with this one because my mum used to let me watch the original Terminator when she watched it, which would have been sort of 85, just after it came out on home video, and I've watched every new release ever since. It was a bit inappropriate for me to be watching the original at the age that I did, but the only scene that I really had a problem with was the one where he takes his eye out in the motel room. The ending blew my mind as a child. I mean, the way that the Terminator just keeps coming back and back, and then he's stalking his way through the factory like some complete and utter nightmare. Wow. It was never really in doubt that this film was going to win the ranking for this particular year. It was very close between second and third. It was not close between first and the rest. So we will see how the original Terminator does in the grand final when we get there. For now, for today, there is only one more question left to ask. Quite a few actually, so I wrote them down. So Dune, they've got a new one for this out quite soon. I'd like to see that and the old one at some point. Missing in Action, which I believe is a Chuck Norris film. I don't think I've seen that one. The Killing Fields is apparently a really good moving film. I've never seen it. Firestarter, I've read the novel Firestarter by Stephen King. I've never seen this particular adaptation. Terror in the Isles, I've heard that's a pretty decent horror film. And Silent Night, Deadly Night, I've heard that's a very good slasher film. And I'm a little bit ashamed that I've not actually seen that yet. Hopefully at some point. I did sit down and try to watch the original Police Academy. I think I actually spent some money to rent it because when I was a kid, I watched Police Academy 3 and really enjoyed it. So when it came to doing this 1984 video, I thought, okay, I'm going to watch the original Police Academy and include it. But honestly, I got 5 minutes into it and the humor was so bad. I was like, I cannot watch another 90 minutes of this. So I turned it off after 5 minutes, even though I'd spent money on it. I'm sorry if you're a Police Academy fan hoping to see a lot of those films in these rankings. You're not going to see any of them apart from part 3. Right, that's all for today. I'll be back soon with a ranking for 1985. Until next time, cheerio, bye-bye.